It is difficult to totally appreciate the impact that our Torah has had upon the world. Progressive innovations like Shabbat, commanding all men, women, children, employees, and beasts of burden to rest from work, had never before been seen on the face of the earth. Other aspects of the Torah were radical reworkings, and I would say improvements upon ideas which were already out there in the world. One example might be the adaptation of Hammurabi's code from literally taking an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, to the more sophisticated notion of evaluating literally the value of one's eye to an individual and providing comparable restitution, as the rabbis have always interpreted that commandment. Believe it or not, but the story of Noah may be seen as a refinement and enhancement of other flood stories which were in the cultural milieu of the ancient Near East. Flood narratives are common in many cultures, most of which appear to predate our own version. There are Native American and Chinese flood stories, but the versions which have the strongest parallels with our own may be found in the Babylonian traditions, traces of which go back some, say, 5,000 years. By comparing and contrasting the Babylonian flood stories with our story, Noah, from this week's Torah portion, we can better appreciate the dramatic response that Noah was making to the flood stories which preceded it. By looking at which cultural components appear to have been either adopted or adapted or jettisoned by our tradition, we'll be in a better position to appreciate what theological innovations were introduced by our Torah with the Noah story as we know it today. Consider what the Torah has to say about Noah. Corruption has contaminated the earth, and Noah is the only righteous person left. God tells Noah to build an ark, leaving very explicit instructions as to all of its dimensions. Noah brings his family and 2 of every animal onto the vessel for their protection. Meanwhile, God floods the entire planet, drowning every other living creature. And after 40 days and 40 nights, Noah sends out a dove, who returns with an olive branch, indicating that there is now dry land to rest the ark upon. Then God establishes a covenant with Noah, which involves 7 new laws, including the mitzvah, the commandment to be fruitful and multiply. In the end, God creates the rainbow as a reminder of that covenant and the promise that there shall never be another flood such as this. This version of the story sounds familiar to us. Before we review the Babylonian epics, there are just a few things that are worth mentioning. First of all, there are many ancient Near Eastern flood tales, all of which bear distinguishing differences. Unfortunately, none of them remain entirely intact to this day. I'll be focusing on 2 Babylonian narratives in particular, the Atrahasis epic and the story of Gilgamesh. So the Atrahasis epic is the earliest Babylonian flood story we have. Archaeologists have actually uncovered tablets from the year 1650 before the Common Era. That's 1,650 years before the year 0. They have tablets that actually tell parts of this story. They just don't have every single tablet, but they've got most of them. There were probably older versions of this story, but this is the oldest archaeological evidence that we have to this day. Incidentally, Atrahasis was known to be such a wise man that his name literally means Atrahasis, extra wise. So the structure of the Atrahasis story is essentially as follows. Humans are created for the purpose of toiling and laboring for the gods, that's in the plural. Then a problem is posed by the creation of the human beings. It appears that the gods neglected to make the human beings mortal. So overpopulation becomes a big issue, and the noise of all of these human beings becomes annoying to the gods. They get irritated by that. So consequently, the gods decided to make a flood to wipe out all of these annoying human beings. Fortunately, one of the gods in this Babylonian tradition, his name is Enki. I love that name. If I ever have another dog, I may name him Enki. Enki foils the plan of the other of the other guys. I'm off track. I'm going to have to edit that out of the video. Enki foils the plan of the other gods by having Atrahasis build an ark, save himself, and offer sacrifices to the gods so that they may appreciate the existence of human beings. As a result, the gods find favor in Atrahasis, and in the end, the gods institute infertility, miscarriage, and infant mortality to keep the population growth in check. The moral of the Atrahasis epic is that people should celebrate these natural phenomena that prevent overpopulation, because that is the very thing that persuades the gods to permit the human beings to live in the first place. Now, not everyone has heard of the Atrahasis epic, but many more people are familiar, at least to some extent, with the Gilgamesh epic. The Gilgamesh epic is actually a very long narrative, only a fraction of which deals with a flood. But despite the popular belief that Gilgamesh is the one who survives the flood, it's actually not Gilgamesh, it's his ancestor, Utnapishtim, who survives the flood, and they come into contact with each other, and Utnapishtim tells the story to his descendant, Gilgamesh. Now, if overpopulation was the key theme of the Atrahasis epic, the underlying theme of the Gilgamesh epic is immortality. Similar, but it's not exactly the same thing. The name Utnapishtim means he who found life. And the Gilgamesh epic is in fact a heroic quest for immortality. And Utnapishtim tells his descendant Gilgamesh exactly how he was able to attain immortality himself. So the Babylonians, by the way, did not understand immortality the same way we do. If people could live forever, then a flood is not going to resolve issues like overpopulation and immortality. The Babylonians understood immortality to mean that one would not die of natural causes, such as old age or disease or anything like that, unless they were actually killed by someone else. In the spirit of Halloween, this is similar to the way people understand vampires to be. A vampire, in theory, would be immortal unless it was killed in the proper way. And that was the concept of immortality in the Babylonian time period. So in contrast with the Atrahasis story, Utnapishtim's story is in the first person, and it's his personal account of survival on an ark, again, using his free will to thwart the wishes of the gods. Because it is written in the first person, Utnapishtim can't tell us the actual reasons that the gods brought the flood. The significance of the flood is therefore focused on an individual rather than the population, or a moment in history, as the other stories may be. Now let's take a look at some of the parallels among the Noah narrative and its Babylonian counterparts. In all these versions, you've got a man who survives on a boat while everyone else perishes in a great flood. One might make a connection between the function of humans in Atrahasis to labor for the gods, and the function of humans in the Noah story in our Torah to serve God. That seems similar on some level. Both Atrahasis and Noah offer sacrifices after their flood. And if you ever look at the ages of people in the Bible before the flood, lifespans generally decline the closer that the births approach the flood. And some say, and actually there's even a midrash that supports this, that the people in the Bible did not die until they were actually washed away by the flood. So this reflects that concept of immortality in the Utnapishtim story. Moreover, the qualities of Atrahasis, who was extra wise, and Utnapishtim, he who found life, seem to correspond with Noah, who's described in the Torah as the one righteous man in his generation. There's something special about these individuals. And it goes without saying that in all three narratives, the flood is caused by divine intervention. Now let's take a look at the contrasts among these three flood stories. There are numerous gods in the Babylonian versions, while our version is predictably monotheistic with only one God. In fact, the God who foils the flood in Atrahasis is not even the same God who caused it, whereas in our version, the one and only God is the one who first causes the flood and then swears never to repeat it again. Lastly, the Babylonian versions were written for entertainment purposes, while ours is considered sacred scripture with lessons that we're meant to draw from it. So the main difference, of course, is the theme. The Noah story is about the eradication of something that is, believe it or not, called Hamas. In Hebrew, the word Hamas is associated with wickedness, and it has connotations of violence, chaos, and lawlessness. We're told that the reason for the flood, it says in Genesis 6:11, is V'tishachet haaretz lifnei haElohim, v'timalei haaretz Hamas. The earth became corrupt to God, and the land was filled with this Hamas, whatever it actually is. Now, it's tempting, I'll admit, to draw some sort of a comparison between this biblical word Hamas and the Hamas that we read about from the Gaza Strip. However, the Palestinian terrorist organization Hamas is actually an acronym, and it doesn't even use the same letters. It stands for the Islamic Resistance Movement, and even when they translate that word into Hebrew, it's transliterated differently. The Hebrew for the Hamas in the Noah story is Chet Mem Samech, and when the terrorist organization is translated, or at least transliterated into Hebrew, there's an aleph in there as well. It's not the same thing. It is important to note that the purpose of the flood is quite similar in both the Babylonian narratives, but quite different in the Noah story. In the Atrahasis epic, the purpose of the flood was overpopulation. In the Gilgamesh epic, it was immortality. Those are similar. But in sharp contrast, the purpose of the flood in Noah was to quash this Hamas, this wickedness, something that we have within our power to control through our own human behavior. That's a major difference between our version of the story and the other ones. Overpopulation, immortality, there are limits to human control. But our own behavior, if there's one thing that we can control, that is our behavior. Another innovation of the Noah story is the introduction of 7 laws after the flood. 2 significant aspects of the Noahitic code are the commandment to be fruitful and multiply, and the commandment not to spill the blood of another human being. The law to be fruitful and multiply is, when you think about it, it's the exact opposite of the concern for overpopulation in Atrahasis. Those are opposites, commanding us to be fruitful and multiply and trying to limit the population. Those are contrasted. And the prohibition against murder is the antithesis of the concern about immortality in Gilgamesh. If Gilgamesh is concerned about people living forever, our Noah version of the story tells us not to murder. It values life and wants to make sure that people have the opportunity to live as long as we can. Unlike Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, which were for entertainment purposes, we see in Noah a religious lesson on the institution of law and order to counter the natural weaknesses of mortal human beings like ourselves. So in conclusion, I would say that our Noah narrative may include some of the same plot motifs which spoke to ancient Near Eastern cultures, but what we find in the Hebrew scriptures is an effort to rework a popular story and give it religious resonance with a moral lesson that life itself is precious and human beings are inherently imperfect, but through an ethical legal system, we can make the world a better place. Shabbat Shalom.